The municipal officer snapped the padlock shut while Maggie's fingers brushed the iron rail and the paper notice rustled against the gate. A line of townspeople pressed close. Maggie heard the padlock's metal click and felt betrayal sit in the hollow under her ribs. Voices rose, sharp, quick, before the dusk swallowed them. They won't open it again. Tom Briggs, and his voice folded into the damp air like a dropped tool. Maggie stepped backward from the gate. She had come to the factory gate at dusk to see the machines one last time and to pull from the office the brass locket she always wore. The immediate problem was obvious. The factory was closed for good and the decision had been made by men who would not stand on the yard. That fact forced a choice. Fight the closure, leave, or keep small reminders and watch the town thin out. The feeling that drove her at that moment was betrayal. It pushed her feet forward toward the office door, even as the padlock's rattle left grit in her mouth. Tom touched Maggie's sleeve. "Maggie," he said. "You shouldn't go in." His hand was calloused from steering wheel and wrench. The sound in his voice was not only warning but calculation. Maggie's reply was a short breath and the way she set her jaw. She moved along the gate to the side entrance and saw Mir Harrow step out from the shadowed doorway, his overcoat buttoned up and his face set like someone balancing a debt ledger. "You can't go in, Maggie, meh." Harrow, it sealed for safety. His palm showed the white dust of paperwork rather than soot. He kept his distance. Maggie put a hand against the office doorframe. Her palm found old varnish and a smear of grease, where hands had leaned in morning after morning. "My locket's in there," she said. "The ledger too." "I need the names." Her voice did not crack. She let the words stand like a request and a demand. Harrow looked at the crowd behind her and then at the council, sent closure notice swinging on the latch. "I don't make the decision, Maggie." "It's sealed." The word sealed like an account number read aloud. Maggie moved forward anyway, fingers seeking the door handle. Mr. Harrow stepped in front of her. He did not raise his voice, but his shoulders set a barrier. Maggie's hands hovered where she had often put them before shifts. For a moment she felt doubt. Could she force the door, push past this man? The doubt hardened into anger when Tom's jaw tightened, and he did not move. A woman in the crowd called. For what? For a sale. Lena, the shopkeeper, was already saying names, creditors, grocers, milk rounds, because she counted losses as if they were inventory. Sister Elsie touched Maggie's arm. "Maggie, please," she said. Sister Elsie's voice always pulled softness into urgency. Maggie let go of the knob and stepped back. The officer at the gate kept his eyes on the road. He had paperwork to post and an ordered step to follow. They gathered at the parish hall by late evening. The room smelled of boiled cabbage from the old kitchen and lemon oil from the hymn books. Chairs scraped. Maggie carried the small oil, darkened handkerchief she kept in her pocket. Tom set a paper cup of tea down like a placard. Voices rose into a hurry. The meeting formed into arguments about leaving, appealing, or resisting. Maggie watched hands gesture and watched faces. When she spoke short sentences that asked for the ledger's names, for a list of those who might stay, for someone to promise to keep those records safe. Tom leaned forward. "We can form a petition, we can ask for work schemes, we can go to the papers, we can—" He stopped and looked at Maggie. His family was young. His words broke into fast measures. What it would cost to take a bus, how many weeks of wages would stretch between here and a job in town. "I can't risk Ida and the boy, Tom." He laid his palms on the table like a man pushing against a door. "I won't." His choice sounded both practical and final. Lena pressed her lips together. "If prices go up, I can't keep the shop open. I can't hold credit. I have bills." "Maggie." "You have bills?" Sister Elsie suggested, making a list of those with urgent claims and asking the council for relief. The list of practical needs shaped their conversation. Rent, winter fuel, the school expenses. Arguments flicked between anger and shame, anger at men who signed papers, shame at the thought of leaving neighbors behind. Maggie listened, measuring which faces would stay and which would go. At night, Maggie and Charlie Ross slipped through a side gate and into the long machine hall. The door that gave on the plant's throat was ajar because the foreman had left it unlocked to check a steam valve earlier. Maggie kept her voice low. "Careful," she said. Dust lay on the machines in thin films you could wipe with the back of your hand. The factory smelled of oil and old cotton and the faint metallic tang of rust. Charlie lifted a crate lid and handed Maggie a taped bundle. An old packing list and a bill of sale. She read the buyer names aloud into the dark. A port company, an out-of-town auction firm, a buyer in the north. They're retaking the gear, Charlie whispered. He tried to lift a coil of wire and nearly dropped it. The sound ricocheted down the hall. Maggie caught her breath and felt a quick spike of fury. They sold it. She said they sold it and didn't tell us. The discovery was sudden and sharp. And it changed everything from an eventual closure to final removal. They moved faster, opening drawers for ledgers and searching for the brass locket. Maggie's fingers found the ledger, its margin smudged with shortened notes, and then a loose tin with a smear of grease where someone had once rested a mug. There was no locket. Maggie's hands went to her collar reflexively and felt the empty weight of absence. The packing list had a column for serial numbers and a stamped consigned. Charlie's face showed confusion, turning to calculation. "We can't stop them if it's on a wagon by dawn," he said. His voice broke into small, brittle lines of disbelief. An event came then. Footsteps on the loading ramp. Maggie and Charlie froze. A light moved past a high window like a slow thumb. They ducked behind a stack of empty crates. For a moment the hall held only the hum of a distant town and the rattle of a shutter. Then a truck engine idled outside. The arrival made the problem urgent. Machines meant to be taken away, a crew preparing to remove a symbol of the town's livelihood. The mini cliffhanger tightened the chapter's middle. Would they be found? Would they be able to stop it? At the town council chamber, the confrontation that followed was not loud, but it was exact. Maggie and Tom confronted Alderman Price and Mayor Harrow with the packing list. Maggie put the paper on the oak table in front of Price and watched him read. Price's hands trembled slightly while he flipped the page. It was sold to cover outstanding loans. Alderman Price. It was the only fiscally responsible option. He did not meet Maggie's eyes. Tom's voice rose. "You signed it. You, Price. You signed away our work." He leaned forward and slapped his palm once on the table. "Tom, Maggie." But Tom went on. "US, we could save it with a council grant. US, there was time." The back and forth grew short and fast. "Price, we had no buyer in town," in lines that tried to be calm. Harrow spoke in measured sentences about safety concerns and liabilities. The exchange had the rhythm of an arbitration interrupted by accusation. Maggie watched the shift in her neighbors' faces. Betrayal widened into anger. The emotional tone altered again when Tom, in a voice that had been counting months and meals, said, "If you won't stop it, I will take Ida to the city. I have to feed them." The choice landed like a verdict. People around the table muttered. Lena stood abruptly. "If Tom leaves, who keeps the shop? Who counts accounts?" The question landed like a set of scales. By dawn, Maggie sat in her small kitchen. The stove had a weak flame and a tin of porridge steamed on top. She pulled her wool shawl tighter and fingered the brass locket she still wore under her collar by habit, nails on the metal that now held no photograph. The argument at council replayed as lined gestures. Price's folded hands, Mr. Harrow's straight back, Tom counting weeks until the bus. She felt doubt, then a tired resolve that she would not leave without making a record. Tom cut in while she cooked. "Maggie, we reset. We leave at 6. Ida's bags are packed. The boy's coat is in the corner." His tone was clipped with practical decisions. Maggie watched him fold a cloth. "Tom," she said, "if you go, tell me one thing. Who will write down the names of those who worked the night shift? Who will keep their hours?" Tom hesitated. "I'll try to send word. I'll send what I can." His voice faltered on the last 2 words. Maggie noticed the shift in his face. From anger and fight to father and provider. Lena came by with bread and coin counted in a small paper wrapper. She put the bag on the table and did not sit. "I can't hold the shop with no trade. Lena." Her voice had the tightness of someone measuring loss. Maggie watched Lena's hands. They were quick and always checked the till. Sister Elsie arrived with a small envelope for church heating. She pressed it into Maggie's palm with eyes that said what could not be said. There would be cold months to solve. The crowd gathered at dawn when the flab rolled into the yard. 2 men climbed down and slung chains across a rusting gear the size of a table. Maggie, Tom, Charlie, and 5 others formed a line at the gate. They locked arms. Maggie's fingers curled into the iron. The crew began to unbolt the gear, and the sound of an impact wrench cut the soft morning. Tom's breathing found a rhythm. Count, hold, count. He kept his gaze fixed on the crew leader. "Get your hands off, or I'll clear you," a man from the crew called. His voice was not threatening in flourish. It was direct. Charlie bristled. "You can't do this, Charlie. You can't take it without telling the town." The back and forth quickened. "We have papers," the crew leader said in a plain voice. "We have a manifest," Tom answered. "We have memories and mouths to feed." The lines collided. The crew looped a chain under the gear. The chain scraped metal and left a thin, bright sound that cut through the murmur. One of the crewmen set a small cutter on a bracket. It spat sparks when it bit iron, and the sound made everyone flinch. Maggie squeezed the gate until metal creaked. Her hands left gray prints on the iron. She felt fear, then a surge of protectiveness that was not a slogan but a simple action. She would not let them take that gear without being recorded. Someone from the crowd, Lena, moved forward and put her palm against Maggie's back. "Maggie, we need a leader for a list. Write the names if you can." "I'll watch the shop's ledger while I can." Her voice was steady with the shopkeeper's habit of inventory. Sister Elsie spoke softly. "I will page the diocese for aid. I will collect signatures." The small council of choices shifted the pitch of the confrontation. The town was not only blocking with bodies but making plans for what to save, who to move, who to contact. The resistance was practical rather than theatrical. The cutter squealed and the crew threatened to call the police. Alderman Price arrived then, breathless, with papers fluttering in his hand. He stood between the crew and the line of townspeople and read the sales clauses out loud in the chair. Roomed hiss of the yard. "The removal is legal," he said. The council voted. "There is compensation." His voice stayed even, but his fingers shook as he refolded the paper. Tom lowered his head and then looked up with a speed that surprised Maggie. "Compensation doesn't stitch cold for the kids in winter, Tom." He leaned closer to Price, starting a rapid exchange. "Tom." Maggie in the middle of the argument, but Tom cut in. There might be a grant. "You would get time," Price answered. "We tried. We were blocked by other liabilities. We did what we could." The words left new divides. Facts that could be checked and choices that had been made. A man from the crew placed his hand on the chain and began to haul. The gear shifted an inch, a sudden small slip that made the crowd gasp. For a half-second the town seemed to hold its breath. Then the chain tightened again, and the film of morning light skimmed across the metal teeth. Charlie moved to grab the chain. Tom shouted, "Stop!" The crew leader held the lever and said, "We will clear this yard on schedule." The men prepared to cut straps. Maggie stepped forward and drove the brass locket from beneath her collar with the heel of her hand. She placed it against a rust flake on the gear's base and pressed it down so the locket sat in the groove where oil had once pooled. "This is for those who worked night shift," she said aloud, not to any official but to the names that would follow. She pulled a thin notebook from her shawl and began to write, slow and legible. Names, dates, single lines about small routines, who baked, who mended, who kept shift without complaint. The cutter whined closer. Sparks flew toward a pulley and struck a patch of oil on the floor. Charlie slammed his hand down on a crate and shouted, "Stop! There's oil there!" The foreman's face moved, an instant of calculation. Damage, liability, the chance of fire. The cutter stopped. The air changed from one of physical threat to negotiation. Men argued about logs, ownership papers, and the cost of towing. Tom shifted his weight and then stepped aside, the decision clear in his tightened shoulders. His family would leave. When the crew finally backed off and loaded the gear onto the flab, the crowd broke into small groups. Some went home to pack. Some went to the shop to check what credit they had left. Maggie walked the empty high street with her notebook in hand. She set the brass locket against the rusting foundation, where the gear had been, and ran a finger along the rim of the metal until it caught on a small burr. The action was quiet and deliberate. She had begun writing lists in the notebook while standing at the gate. Now she wrote short notes about routines and names, about the morning men who lit the boilers and the women who boiled dye pots. She thought about Tom's face as he left a line of people gathered by the bus stop and pressed a small envelope of coin into Lena's hands. She thought about Charlie's quick hands and Sister Elsie's small contributions to the church fund. The decisions others made during the night had shifted the town's possible futures. Some bought tickets, some signed petitions, some tightened belts to last the winter. Maggie's choice was different. She would not march to the city tomorrow. She would stay to write list and keep the ledger of ordinary work. By mid-morning the flatbed drove away. Maggie watched the dust settle along the road where the gear had been. She closed the small notebook and tucked it into her shawl. Then she placed her hand over the brass locket one more time, as if closing a wound. She began to walk toward the parish hall to pass the ledger to Sister Elsie and to speak with Lena about keeping copies in the shop. The chapter ended with a concrete act. Maggie folded the first page into a protective corner of the ledger and locked it inside the drawer of the parish hall desk before turning the key and asking Sister Elsie to note who would take what copies. The lock clicked. The names were safe for now. Maggie pushed the canteen door and found men drawing tickets from a stamped crate list while a buyer's notice flapped from a beam. Betrayal sat in the room like an honest dirt stain, obvious stubborn not to be washed away by words. Men with clipboards moved between tables, counting plates and kettles, and a new buyer's logo had been stenciled onto wooden crates. "They're retaking the tools," somebody said. Maggie's fingers closed around the doorframe. She had stood at gates before when the municipal officer snapped a padlock shut. She had felt that metal click under her ribs. Now the evidence was inside the hall. She stepped through the doorway and lifted the collar of her shawl against the smell of oil and steam. Maggie's hands were collused. They remembered the rhythm of a lathe and the staccato beat of the factory whistle. She moved toward a table where a man in a dark coat drew a ticket and placed it into a tin. "Maggie," he said without looking up. She recognized Tom Bridger's voice behind her before she saw him. The sound of the ticket's edge on tin matched the sound of metal things leaving a place that had once kept the town fed. The immediate problem was clear. The factory was not closing in order, it was being stripped and sold. Tom stepped forward, his jaw worked. He had once run a packing line and knew what a crate stamp could mean. They've marked machines for export. Tom. He spat into the cobbles. The foreman's cart is already putting boards on the lorry. Maggie's eyes fixed on a beam where the buyer's notice shivered in late sun. She moved toward it and read the name. A distant firm's Port City, a seal and export code. The betrayal felt less like an emotion and more like a tool. It forced choices. Maggie's jaw tightened. She had come for a keepsake, a chipped teacup from the canteen shelf, and instead found proof that the town's work was being measured and marked for removal. The canteen cook, a woman with flour, streaked hands named Elsie Cartwright, stood with a tea towel wrapped around her fist. "We thought they'd mothball it." Elsie. Her voice trembled on the last word. They'd mothball it. "Not ship the lot." Maggie moved across the room and took the tea towel from her. "Show me the list." "Maggie." She kept her voice low. Maggie's steadiness had always been a sort of argument. She listened, then acted. That steadiness now had to become louder than the men with tickets. A man at the far table lifted his head. "Council's been told," he said. "Council signed the transfer." "There's a timetable." Tom slammed his palm onto the table. "Who signed? Who put the town's name to papers and didn't tell us?" His question was a sound that wanted an answer in the room. The municipal officer, who had been standing near crates, shifted his weight and cleared his throat. He kept his hands folded where everyone could see them. "We have an arrangement," he said. "Compensation offered. Orderly removal. No need for protest." The officer's phrase tried to steady the scene, but it came out thin. Maggie's suspicion hardened into a different motion. She walked between stacks of cups and trays to the window and pressed her palm flat to the glass. Outside, the factory yard smelled of coal and cut timber. A cart's wheel left a fresh mark in the dust. She thought of the padlock's metal click from the gate the other night, and how a paper notice had fluttered like a small, official lie. The stakes were no longer only loss of wages. The town's tools, the machines that had defined people's days, were disappearing. Maggie folded her hands around the tea towel until the fabric creased under her fingers. "If they're reselling the equipment," she said, "they're reselling our reason to stay." Her voice did not rise. She let that idea hang over the table like a decision. Outside the canteen doorway, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered on the cobbles. Mrs. Keene was there, packing a child's toy into a small box with stiff hands. A young father pushed a cart containing a folded mattress. A woman whose husband worked in maintenance clutched a bundle of tools like someone holding the last warm coin in a pocket. Maggie moved back out to them and lifted the edge of the notice so everyone could see the export seal. "They've got a buyer lined up," she said. The crowd shifted. Tom crossed his arms. "What do we save?" He asked. "Do we stand and watch them haul away the machines? Do we try to stop a lorry full of parts?" His voice asked the question that had to be answered in action. A quarrel followed, quick and sharp. "Save what's ours." Mrs. Keene boxed the little things. "Take the baby's cot mattress." "You can't take the big machines." Another man called. "You can't stop a lorry." "Who says not?" Tom answered. "We can block the gate. We can go to the docks. We can. But what if they call the police?" Someone asked, "What if the municipal officer's papers?" Elsie. Maggie watched the exchange, words traded like small weapons. Each reply adjusted people's aims. In those lines, the town's bonds frayed and then knotted again. Some voices pushed for immediate resistance. Others counted the price of staying. An hour later, Councilman Reed arrived with a sealed envelope and a thin timetable. He walked into the forecourt with a thin smile, his coat buttoned as if for a ceremony. He offered the papers and Reed aloud the official line. Compensation rates, a schedule for removal, and legal language that tried to sound generous. "We can offer relocation stipends," he said. "We'll stagger the departures." Maggie took the envelope and let her thumb run along the edge of the paper. The paper smelled faintly of bureaucratic ink. "Who signed this?" "Maggie." She held the page out so the men could see. "Who authorized the export?" Her voice stayed even, but her fingers drummed the paper. She had learned confrontation in lunchroom corners and factory foremen's offices. Asking direct questions often forced direct answers. Councilman Reed's smile did not reach his eyes. "This is authorized at the council level," he said. "There was oversight. We are trying to keep order." The municipal officer stood near him and nodded. Tom stepped forward. "Oversight won't stop a crate on a ship." Tom, who authorized payments to that firm, who took money from the council and sent it off. He spoke fast, each word a small strike. Councilman Reed's jaw tightened. He pressed his fingers together and answered slowly. "There are arrangements. Legal counsel handled it. It's proper procedure." Maggie saw how the man's calm was meant to deflect a direct line of sight. She saw how his words had the soft, deflecting rhythm of a practiced official. Maggie's suspicion moved to anger. She reached into the envelope and pulled out a form with a stamped account number. The number did not match a local ledger she knew. The crowd grew restless. Elsie made a noise like someone swallowing anger. "Maggie, we have to decide now," she said. "Will you help pack for Mrs. Keene? Will you ask Tom to stand by the dock? We need choices, not papers." The room divided into small councils. Arguments flickered between staying to guard the site and leaving with what could be salvaged. Voices rose and fell in quick succession. 3 men offering to stand watch. 2 families saying they must leave that night to find work elsewhere. Someone mentioning a cousin in the port who might store a machine if they could get it there. The parish clock chimed in the distance. Time became another actor. Its sound pushed decisions forward. Maggie went up the terraced row with boxes and a list. She helped Mrs. Keene fold a child's blanket into a small box and taped it shut. They worked with hands rather than speeches. "Keep this." Maggie, pressing the toy into the box. "Tell them about the kettle, not the lathe. Tell them about dinners, not production numbers." Mrs. Keene's fingers trembled when she tied the string. "They'll remember the whistle anyhow," she said, and Maggie saw acceptance making quiet, practical choices. On the lane, a family she knew folded a mattress onto a cart and watched the street for passing carts. The small domestic acts felt like votes being cast. At dusk, when light thinned and the factory's long hall looked like a corridor to another world, Maggie and Tom slipped through a side door. They moved with the cadence of people who had once worked between machines and knew where the oil stained the floor. The machine hall was long and smelled of warm iron and old grease. Shafts of lamplight cut through soot, streaked windows and landed on rows of cold, idle machinery. Maggie's boots scuffed the dust. They passed crates. Some were stamped with the distant firm's mark. Tom crouched and ran his hand along a crate's side, feeling the rough wood. They reached a workbench where oil had pooled into a dark ring. Tom nudged a loose board and a shadowed space appeared beneath. Maggie knelt and reached under the bench. Her fingers closed on something that was not wood. A ledger, its cover stiff with grime and a corner torn. She pulled it free. The small moment, her hand finding the book, was a physical discovery that changed the direction of the day. Maggie opened the ledger and flipped through pages crowded with handwriting, names, dates, sums, transfer orders listed machines and destinations. Receipts showed shipment weights. Then Maggie found coded entries and a series of payments routed through a council account number. Her mouth went dry. Tom leaned over her shoulder and read, "Payments to an agent in the port," he said. "And look, there's a name," he pointed. The name matched an assistant in the council office. The ledger tied the owner's agent to the buyer and showed money flowing through the council's books. The town's earlier suspicion shifted into a concrete accusation. They left the hall with the ledger tucked under Maggie's arm. Outside, a dock cart creaked. Lights moved at the far end of the yard where hired hands stacked crates. The ledger was a new object in the story. It made the betrayal precise. Maggie and Tom walked faster toward the forecourt where a small crowd was watching the last carts. "We have proof." "Maggie, Tom, this isn't an orderly removal. It's a sale. Someone's pocketing our machines," her voice carried under the low lamplight. At dusk, Councilman Reed's offer felt hollow. The municipal officer began to fidget. Harlan Pike, the hired foreman, stood by a loaded cart and clucked his tongue like a man who had done this before. He kept his hat low. "It's all legal." Harlan through his teeth. Orders came from above. "We were just following instructions." Tom looked at Harlan as if the man had spit into the faces of everyone present. "You reshipping our bread lines overseas, Tom. You retaking what paid wages for 20 years. Who's benefiting?" Harlan's face tightened. He looked toward the municipal officer as if seeking permission. A small group of townspeople gathered and edged toward the dock. Maggie took the ledger out and held it high enough for those nearest to see. "Look," she said. "This shows the transfers. It shows where the money went." Voices rose. "Councilman Reed, you can't make accusations from a ledger taken from private property." Maggie's reply was a short, precise pulse. "The ledger was under a bench we all used for work," she said. "This bench saw the hands that wound the machines. Those hands trusted this place. Now those hands are empty." The crowd's mood shifted. Suspicion became anger. The confrontation at the dock strained into a standoff. A loading cart had the last heavy machine strapped and ready. Harlan's hired hands stood between the cart and the people at the gate. The municipal officer called for calm. A woman pushed forward and tried to grab a crate strap, and a man behind her bellowed when a hand went to her shoulder. Tom shoved past and planted himself in front of the cart. "Stop that cart, Tom. Stop it now." He sounded older than his years, hoarse with the tiredness of men who had worked too long. Harlan barked a command. The men holding the cart tightened their grips. Maggie's action was immediate. She stepped in front of the loaded machine, her body placing itself between metal and road, and held up the ledger. "You will not roll that away," she said. Her voice had the steady rasp she kept for confessionals and arguments. She used the ledger as proof and as a mirror. People at her back repeated her words. "Stop it!" they said. "Stop it?" The municipal officer moved closer to the hired hands and put a hand on Harlan's shoulder as if law and hired muscle could decide who was right. The first push came from a hired hand who shoved Tom in the chest. Tom staggered but did not fall. He looked at Maggie and said, "Maggie, go get Mrs. Keene's box, get Elsie. Keep them safe." His line was short, practical. Maggie felt fear like something at the base of her throat. Her hands tightened around the ledger. "No," she told Tom, "I'm not leaving the gate." Their exchange was quick, no speeches, only choices. A scuffle began. People grabbed straps, a child screamed. Councilman Reed stepped between the groups and tried to read a clause from the timetable paper, as if the law's words could still settle muscle and anger. The standoff turned physical. Harlan's men hauled at the cart's harness. A woman I saw earlier shoved a crate and knocked a hired hand sideways. Tom lunged and caught a strap, hands tangled. Maggie pushed between two men and felt her shawl snag on a nail. Fabric tore and her shoulder burned. Someone shouted that police were on the way. The municipal officer held his paper like a shield and called for order. "Order!" he said, and then the word fell into the middle of hands and feet and metal. Harlan barked, "Back, or I'll call the docks patrol." The threat didn't frighten the townspeople so much as sharpened their will. Resistance moved from shouting to blocking. In the MLE, a young man from the terrace ran down and threw himself at the cart's wheel. He aimed to wedge a plank under it. A hired hand twisted and pushed him away. Tom grabbed the man's arm and yanked him free. The ledger slipped from Maggie's grip and fell face down into the mud. Someone stepped on it. For a breath, the document that had held the story of payments lay in the dirt. That moment, ledger in the mud, was a small cliffhanger. Would proof be destroyed? Would their case vanish under trampling feet? Tom found the ledger and held it aloft, mud spattering his sleeve. "You see this?" He shouted. "You see where the money went?" The sight of the stamped council account made murmurs roll through the crowd. Councilman Reed's face showed a new edge. He was no longer just a smooth voice with papers. He glared at the municipal officer. "You authorized this?" Tom demanded. "You signed our machines away." The officer's mouth opened and closed. He had no clear answer. Harlan reached for the ledger. His hand closed on the corner. The town surged forward. Hands seized straps. Someone slammed a plank across a cart wheel. The cart bucked. In the tussle, the strap holding the heavy machine slipped and a metal bar struck the cobbles with a sound like a bell. Harlan cursed and shoved. Then, as if a single thought moved through the crowd, people stepped back from the machine. No one wanted to be crushed beneath its weight. The moment of fear broke the immediate push. Breaths came faster. A neighbor pulled a woman away who was trying to climb onto the cart. When the first carts finally rolled away at dawn, they were met with a quiet that felt like acceptance carved solid. Maggie stood at the gate with a child from the street who clutched a toy. Her hands smelled of coal and ledger ink. She held a small brass washer she had taken from between the ledger's pages. Tom's shoulders were slumped. Elsie had a bandage on her wrist from where she had grabbed a strap. Councilman Reed watched from his carriage as the last machine disappeared into the low light. The municipal officer looked at the ground. Harlan's hired hands had the look of men who had done work and been paid to do it. Maggie stepped forward and pinned the washer into the gate's ironwork. Her fingers worked the metal around the washer until it sat flush in a crack where the padlock once lay. The act was not a speech. It was a small, public record, a makeshift marker that said someone had tried to stop the last load. The child next to her touched the washer with a careful finger and then pulled away. A cart rolled past and the wheels left a track that would fade, but the washer would remain. Tom put a hand on Maggie's shoulder and squeezed once. We did what we could. His line was short and carried the work's wariness. Maggie watched the road until the carts turned the bend. The town's losses were counted differently now. Not only in machines shipped, but in households broken into choices, in the families who had left with mattresses on carts, in the people who stayed because they had nothing else. She could list names of those who had left and those who had stayed, and the reasons were practical. Work, kin, age. The ledger had given them proof. The ledger had not given them restitution. The council's papers had not halted the lorries. Yet in the gate's ironwork the washer caught lamplight and held a small, stubborn shine. As the sun rose higher, people began to move in smaller circles. Neighbors checking on what remained, Elsie tallying plates, Mrs. Keene lifting the box with the toy and closing the lid. A woman called out that she had found a kettle in a basement and would keep it for the lunchroom. Tom spoke to Harlan briefly. Their words were businesslike and clipped. They had shared a fight, and the conversation afterwards needed no dramatic speeches. The municipal officer folded his papers and walked away with them under his arm. Councilman Reed's carriage had already rattled off toward the center. The town resumed its practical duties: mending, counting, cataloging. Maggie stayed by the gate until the light warmed the bricks. She ran a thumb over the brass washer and felt the ledger's ink under her nails. The ledger would be copied, she decided. She would put the pages into more hands. That decision was not a promise of victory. It was an action she could make. She tucked the ledger under her arm and walked back toward the terrace where boxes waited to be sealed. Her voice to Mrs. Keene was small and clear. "Lock that box," she said. "Write the toy's name on it." Mrs. Keene nodded and tied the string. The town's small rituals continued. Securing things, marking names, making sure what remained could be remembered. When Maggie reached the canteen steps, she paused and looked once more at the factory gate where the washer sat. The sound of the last cart had faded, replaced by the steady noise of people sorting their days. The choices had been made in a conflict of hands, papers, and will. The ledger had revealed the route of money. The dock fight had shown who would act and who would watch. Her body ached from the pushing and pulling, but the H was a record of having been where decisions were made. She set the ledger on the canteen table and folded her hands on top of it for a moment. Then she stood and began to call names to each neighbor who had not left, listing tasks and small duties. She moved into work. To catalog, to speak to those who still had a voice, and to keep the washer as a marker on the gate. The morning had not changed the loss. It had only made the town's new shape visible. Maggie tied her shawl and walked out to help lift a crate, her step steady and ready for the slow, practical labor of what came next. The clerk struck the hammer twice, and the metal head rang against the factory door. Maggie stepped forward, pressed her fingertips over the paper, and read the buyer's name beneath the official stamp. Betrayal sat in her throat like a stone. Voices behind her pushed and wanted anger. Her jaw tightened instead. The notice made the sale real. The question now was whether anyone could stop the work that would empty the town. Maggie had been at the gate when the padlock first snapped shut. She remembered the municipal officer's hand on the metal and the padlock's hard click. She remembered the price list nailed to the wall during the last load. Those memories were now precise facts, lists, stamps, signatures. She folded the paper back along the crease, feeling the fibrous tear at the edge. She kept her hand on the door a beat longer than the others. She needed to know where the betrayal had started. She needed names. Someone in the crowd hissed, "Hargraves." A man said, "Hargraves" again. The word landed like a small report. Tom pushed closer. His coat smelled of machine oil and yesterday's rain. "Maggie," he said, voice rough, "they've got the paperwork. It says immediate strip out. Pensions are in that clause." Maggie looked at Tom. "Read it out," she said. Tom found a crease and read numbers slowly. "It voids communal claims if an injunction isn't filed within 10 days. It lists machines already sold to firms in Wrentham and Leeds. He stopped, swallowed. "It says pension allocations are shown as transferred or missing." A low sound moved through the crowd. Maggie's hands tightened around the paper until the edges bent. Suspicion had been there since the padlock. Now it moved into anger. She folded the notice back into her pocket as if she could carry the proof. "We go to the hall now," she said. The sound of her voice surprised her. It was steadier than she felt at the pub that afternoon. Names were said like accusations. The room smelled of boiled cabbage, wet wool, and bitter ale. Lamps hummed above scarred tables. Reverend Ellis sat with his Bible closed, palms flat on the wood, but his eyes kept flicking to the doorway. Men and women filled the benches. Someone counted off the trains that would no longer pass. Someone else named shops that would close. "We have to stop this, Tom. Hargraves can't take our machines and our pensions and call it legal. We can ask for an injunction." Reverend Ellis replied, "We can petition. But injunctions cost money and time. Who pays? Who leads?" Maggie watched them argue. She noticed the smallest things. The way Reverend Ellis rubbed one knuckle against the other when he worried. How Tom's mouth pushed out when he weighed options. She felt another shift from suspicion to a cold clarity about what to do next. She could not lead a courtroom fight, but she could find evidence. She could make the claim tangible. "Maggie," said Lottie from the back, "what did you see at the office?" Maggie named the buyer. She named the clause that cut pensions. What she had felt when the notice was hammered up. People leaned in. Names were repeated. Plans thickened. The conversation was quick and jagged. Arguments moved in 3-line bursts, then broke into quieter exchanges. "We ask the municipal officer for the ledger. Tom, if there's a list of machines sold that shows they sold things off before notifying us. That is theft, isn't it? Reverend, it could be Reverend Ellis, but we must prove it. We must show the dates and the signatures." He tapped the table with a single finger. "Maggie, you know the office. You have that way with the town records." Maggie felt the choice compress into a narrow path. She had a ledger in mind, the clerk's back room, where the municipal ledgers sat beneath a stack of petty receipts. She could go that night. She could either find the theft or find nothing. The shift moved inside her. Anger softened into a cautious hope that evidence might change the fight. They argued until dusk. Tom and Reverend Ellis spoke fast at the table and traded 3 quick lines each about whether to involve the press, whether to call a solicitor, whether to attempt a peaceful protest at dawn. Maggie listened and stored details: names, dates, potential witnesses. When the door opened and a man in a sharp suit walked in, the room's air tightened again. The suited man introduced himself. "Representative for Mr. Hargraves," he said, and he set a leather folder on the bar. He spoke with no freight in his voice. He read the dates aloud and handed copies of the final terms across the bench. "Immediate strip out and demolition within 14 days, he said. "All outstanding claims resolved according to the sales schedule." Tom's hand slammed the table. "You can't do this to our pensions," he said. "Tom," the representative replied flatly, "the sale is lawful. The schedule names the assets sold. You are entitled to contest it in court, but that does not delay the strip out under these terms." Reverend Ellis leaned forward. "There's a clause here with unusual wording. What does transfer of allocation mean?" The representative smiled thinly. "It means that obligations have been assigned. If you pursue an injunction, you will have to prove you have standing." "Hargraves will comply with legal process." Maggie watched the folder as if the pages might hide a seam she could pry open. She felt the second sharp emotion move through her: fear that legal maneuvers would arrive too late. She also felt a brittle resolve. If the paper said pensions might be erased, then a ledger with dates could show sell-offs done before the public notice. She needed proof of prior transfer. That night, when the pub emptied, Maggie and Tom made a choice. They slipped around the back of the municipal office under a sky that had cleared to bitter cold. The yard gate had a gap, as the outline had said in the beat. Tom found a loose board. Maggie eased through and felt wood rub the palm of her hand. They moved without light, keeping to shadowed shapes of crates and rusted equipment. Inside the office, the clerk's ledger lay beneath a stack of invoices and a half-drunk cup of tea. Maggie used the small penknife in her pocket to lift a corner of the cloth covering the shelf and pushed 2 volumes to the floor. Pages fell open to lists of serial numbers and destinations. Tom whispered the names of firms. Maggie read with her finger, tracing dates. Many entries showed machines already listed as sold weeks before the public notice. "Look," Tom breathed. "Rentham, Leeds, machines out, dates here." Maggie felt a shift again. From cautious hope to a fierce recognition that the town had been deliberately emptied. She turned pages faster. At the back, a ledger column had been altered. A pen had darkened over earlier numbers. Next to it were notes that mentioned pension allocations. A short notation read: "Allocations to be reconciled with buyer ledger," and then the clerk's initials. They froze when footsteps sounded in the corridor. The municipal security officer appeared in the doorway with a lamp. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Maggie stepped forward. "We're rechecking records," she said. "We have reason to believe assets were sold before notice." The officer's face was hard. "Removal starts at dawn." "You need Ed. This is private property." Tom reached for a ledger and misjudged its edge. A scrap of paper slipped into the officer's lamp pool. The security man moved faster than either of them expected. For a second there was a physical jolt, a reached hand, a lamp swayed. Then Maggie shoved the brass plaque she'd taken from beneath the desk into her coat and shoved Tom toward the window. They crawled through the gap they had entered and slid into the yard as the officer's lamplight cut across the doorway. They ran toward the hedgerow with the plaque and a single gear tucked into a sack. Outside, panting, Maggie held the gear in her palm and felt its rough teeth against her thumb. The physical contact anchored her. She had evidence. She had a keepsake that testified to the machines that had powered the town's mornings. The hidden manifests proved more. Signatures that showed internal sell-off and a column of missing pension allocations. The discovery changed the fight from sentimental salvage to a claim of theft. They took the documents to Reverend Ellis that night. He read with his glasses low on his nose and said only 2 words at first: "This is theft." Then he listed concrete steps. A solicitor who would look at an injunction, a clerk in Rentham who could confirm purchases, an open letter to the municipal council. Maggie watched them plan. She spoke rarely but with weight. "We need to show timeline and signatures," she said. "We need witnesses who handled the loads." Weeks narrowed to deadlines. The discovery forced the town's urgency into action. People who had shuffled through grief now leaned toward confrontation. Notices were posted, names were called. Maggie and Tom collected statements from ex-workers who remembered crates that left with destination tags. Lottie produced a photograph of the last load stacked at the yard with a stamping that matched a ledger entry. Small concrete things accumulated toward proof. Then came the meeting at the municipal hall, the town's emergency session. The hall filled with people who had not spoken until they needed to. Lamps swung low. Reverend Ellis opened with calm words and handed a paper to the clerk. Mr. Hargreaves's representative came, with his folder and a lawyer in tow. The municipal officer sat flanked by two men in plain suits. The room smelled of damp coats and heated anger. Maggie stood and placed the ledger pages on the table with her fingertips flat, she the story plainly. Where she and Tom had entered, what pages they had found, who had signed what. Her voice was steady though her hands trembled when she turned a page. She read dates aloud and watched faces. Each date made the sale look like a sequence of deliberate moves. "This ledger shows sales before public notice," she said. The representative scoffed. "These are transfers, proper accounting. Mr. Hargreaves has followed legal procedure." Tom cut in. "Then show us the receipts. Show us the money flow you sold the machines. Where's the record of pension reconciliation?" Representative: "You do not understand corporate transfers, Reverend Ellis. You sold people's livelihoods without notice to them." Representative: "The sale is lawful. You will have recourse in court. Until then, the schedule stands." The exchange accelerated. 3 lines of rapid back and forth followed as tempers rose. "Tom, you can't call this lawful and call it just." Representative: "This is commerce, not charity, Reverend Ellis. Commerce that strips a town of its future must be held to account." Representative: "Your account will be heard in the proper forum." Arguments fractured into shoving. A neighbor lunged at the representative and collided with the municipal officer. Someone hit the table. A man fell and struck his head on the corner. Blood pooled on the floorcloth. The hall erupted with a rawness that replaced careful speech. In the chaos, the representative reached into his folder and extracted a court order stamped with a county seal. He read it aloud. An order clearing the sale under emergency powers. The room went quiet in a way that felt like a new, heavier sound. Maggie felt a drop of something hot at her temple and did not know if it was sweat or anger. She kept her voice low. "We can appeal," she said. "We can make the case that this ledger proves prior sale and that the council misled the people." Reverend Ellis touched her sleeve. "Maggie, the court order presents a new obstacle. It appears to grant immediate action. We can file, but it may not delay the strip out," someone in the back muttered. Tom's face had gone tight. For a moment Maggie thought the meeting would dissolve into another scuffle or worse. Then Reverend Ellis stood and spoke in a tone that had steadiness. He proposed a narrow set of demands: temporary suspension of strip out until an independent audit could be held, immediate freezing of assets meant for pensions, and a public review of the municipal clerk's actions. He the representative whether Mr. Hargreaves would agree to mediation. The representative hesitated, then offered a formulaic refusal. The municipal officer smiled thinly. "The court order stands. Removal begins tomorrow." That sentence landed like a verdict. The meeting reached its peak in confusion and a new hard fear. People shouted, reached for one another, cried names aloud. Maggie felt her chest compress. Her hands went cold. The ledger pages on the table lay like evidence that meant little against stamped justice. The room shifted from argument to a concentrated panic about what to salvage before dawn. At that moment, a small detail changed everything. Reverend Ellis produced a list of names, men and women who had signed for loads, drivers, dock foremen. He read a name that matched an entry in Maggie's ledger that had been crossed out and annotated. The representative's lawyer glanced at the paper and faltered. "Where did Reverend Ellis get that?" The lawyer demanded. "Reverend Ellis." From a steward in Wrentham who confirmed purchases under a different vendor name. "He will testify that machines were misattributed." A pause stretched. The officer's jaw tightened. The representative's face reddened. For the first time in the meeting, the idea of fraud appeared in plain words. Tom gripped Maggie's shoulder. "They can't hide behind a court stamp if people in Wrentham confirm deceptive records," he said. The lawyer spoke rapidly then, trying to control damage. He produced alternative paperwork and argued that the steward's note was hearsay. The exchange became legal and technical, and for a moment indecipherable to those without practice. But people's eyes kept returning to the ledger pages and to the note Reverend Ellis had read. The hall closed that night with no clear victory. One neighbor left with a bleeding brow. The representative left under escort. The municipal officer announced removal at dawn. Maggie and Tom walked home in a silence filled with the rustle of coats. They had pushed the fight to a higher place, but the court order and the representative's folder still loomed. Their small win, the steward's note, had opened a chance but not a triumph. At the gate before dawn, after the meeting thinned and most people had gone home, Maggie returned alone. The factory yard was a silhouette against a paling sky. She felt the gear and brass plaque in her pocket like small necessary proof. Tom had been there briefly. He had pressed a list of names into her hand and then left to help pack a neighbor's trunk. Maggie walked the perimeter where they'd once slipped through and pressed her palm flat against the iron rail. She slid the gear and plaque into a cloth and into her coat. Her decision was quiet and solid. She would carry the town's memory in objects and in a list of names. She would not stop the sale by force. The ledger and the steward's note would become evidence for a legal appeal she could not lead alone. So she chose the deliberate action she could perform. To document, to pass on, to keep the exact words and details alive. She wrote the names on a small scrap of paper. Those who had loaded the last cart, the drivers, the clerk's initials. She tucked the scrap into the locket and closed it. Weeks later the carriage took the last machine. Families left with trunks and a few personal goods. Maggie walked with a short procession of lanterns. Neighbors who had lost everything exchanged small kindnesses, a bundle of bread, a kettle, a blanket. They did not promise to return. They tidied houses for each other. People kissed cheeks, hugged shoulders, and moved on. At the yard, Maggie waited until the cart had creaked away. A young apprentice stood by the gate with a trunk that looked too small for the boxes of memories he carried. His face was set in a way that reminded Maggie of her younger self, steady, practical, careful with hands. She opened the locket and slipped the scrap of names and a single piece of the brass plaque into the apprentice's palm. "Tommy, to give this to you," she said. Her voice held no sermon. The apprentice looked down at the metal and then up at her. "Who do I tell?" he asked. "Tell the solicitor if he asks. Give the names to Reverend Ellis if they need witnesses. And keep this locket in your trunk. When you find work, keep these lines written down." He closed his fingers around the brass. "Maggie, will you?" She shook her head once. "I will not leave everything to a court that moves like winter. I will write the routines, the start times, the men who wound machines at 6:50, the woman who kept the roll books by the accounting desk. I will write it down and pass it along. You will carry it out." He nodded. He shouldered his trunk and turned. The procession moved along the street lined with empty houses. Maggie watched the apprentice walk until he was only a small shape beneath the lamplight. She did not follow. She had pockets of evidence, a list in her hand, a locket with names. She had chosen the work that would follow them. Small acts of preservation, careful records, a quiet insistence that the town's facts be known. Later that day Maggie sat in her kitchen with the ledger photocopy beneath the soot, dark teacup. Reverend Ellis visited and read through her notes. Tom came and left with a folded photograph of the last load. They spoke about legal strategy and practical steps in short, simple sentences. They arranged for Reverend Ellis to send the steward's affidavit to a solicitor in Wrentham and to request a temporary stay. They did not expect miracles. They expected process. The court would later grant a limited review. The solicitor found that certain sales lacked proper authorization. Some pension allocations were restored after a negotiation. Not everything returned. Machines that had left the yard could not be fetched back. Families who had already gone remained gone. But thanks to ledgers, witness lists, and Reverend Ellis's steward, pensions that had been categorized as missing were traced to accounts that had been reassigned and then partially reconciled. When the solicitor called Maggie with the news, she folded the phone into her shirt and breathed without thinking. There was relief, not victory. There was a practical restitution that would buy a few families small sums and some clarity. The town would not be rebuilt in an instant. The factory would not resume its old rhythms. But some names on the pension list would be honored. Maggie kept the brass plaque and the gear until the apprentice wrote to her months later from a new town where he had found an apprenticeship on a smaller machine line. He enclosed a short note and a photograph of the locket hanging in his new trunk. He had added 2 names to her list. Names of men who had helped him on the road and had kept watch when they camped. Maggie wrote back with precise details about the ledger entries and the dates for the solicitor's records. A year after the notice, Maggie walked past the empty yard one last time. A council crew had left behind a single rusting girder. The brick mouth of the factory was boarded. A few creepers had taken root in cracks. She touched the iron rail. She had done what she could. She had documented the names, kept a gear, passed on a locket, and offered witness lists to the solicitor. She had not prevented the town from shrinking, but she had prevented its facts from being erased. She folded the final packet of copies and handed them to Reverend Ellis at his door. He took them and said simply, "You kept the town's truth." Maggie pressed the gear into his palm. "Keep them honest," she said. He nodded. The wind pushed at his coat. The 2 of them stood a moment, then moved apart. At dawn on the day the last carriage went, Maggie had given the apprentice the locket and the list. That act ended the chapter that had begun with a hammered notice and a padlock's click. It was a small act of preservation, not a triumph. It tied to the concrete events of the chapter. The hammered notice, the pub argument, the representative's folder, the clandestine ledger search, the meeting's scuffle, the court order, Reverend Ellis's steward, and the final procession. Maggie folded the last page of her notes and put them in the brass locket. She closed it and buttoned her coat. A young man with a trunk passed under the lamplight. She watched him until he was out of sight and then turned toward home, the locket warm against her chest. She stepped away from the gate and walked into a street where doors were being locked and windows shuttered. On the corner, Tom held his hat low and tipped it at her in a small, exact gesture. Maggie nodded. She had traded a fight she could not win by force for the slow work that mattered. Naming, recording, handing truth along. The last machine left the yard at noon. Maggie watched it go until it was a dot on the road, and then she went inside to write the day's entries into a ledger that she would leave for those who followed. The final sound of the chapter was not a speech or a promise. It was a deliberate action. Maggie set the brass plaque on the top shelf, slipped the list of names into the locket, locked the kitchen drawer, and turned the key. The key clicked. That click closed a small loop of duty and memory tied to concrete records and hands that had worked there once.